A dusty road stretches endlessly toward a horizon that seems to be on fire, the Texas sun bleeding shades of bruised purple and burnt orange across the sky, while the only sound is the rhythmic crunch of tires on gravel and the mournful cry of a hawk circling above. The heat was not just a temperature, it was a physical weight that pressed down on the shoulders of anyone foolish enough to be out in the middle of the afternoon in South Texas. It was the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and dance above the asphalt, turning the distant fence lines into wavering ghosts. George Strait sat behind the wheel of his battered Chevrolet Silverado, a truck that had seen more miles of ranch land than highway. He was not the king of country in this moment. He was just a man with dirt under his fingernails and a sweat-stained hat pulled low over his eyes. His hands, gripping the steering wheel, were a map of his life. Calloused, strong, weathered by ropes and reins and the neck of a guitar. He drove slowly, checking the perimeter of the property, his eyes scanning for breaks in the barbed wire or cattle that might have wandered too close to the dry creek bed. It was a ritual. It was his sanctuary. Here the roar of the stadiums was replaced by the lowing of Brangus cattle. Here the blinding spotlights were replaced by the unforgiving sun. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of sagebrush and dry earth, a smell that grounded him more than any platinum record ever could. But today the silence of the ranch felt different. It felt heavy. It felt like the calm before a tornado that was spinning silently in the digital clouds, ready to touch down and destroy everything he had built, not with wind, but with words. Inside the main house, the air conditioning hummed a desperate battle against the climate. Norma Strait stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly as she held a glass of iced tea that was sweating condensation onto the granite countertop. She wasn't looking at the beautiful view of the hills outside the window. She was staring at the iPad lying on the heavy oak table. The screen was bright, an artificial glare that seemed intrusive in the rustic warmth of their home. On the screen, a video was looping. It was short, only 15 seconds, but those 15 seconds were tearing their world apart. It showed George walking out of a building in Nashville 3 days ago. The camera angle was low, shaky, filmed from a phone. In the frame, a young man with bleached blonde hair and a designer jacket. Kyler J., a rising pop country influencer with millions of followers and zero respect for tradition, was reaching out, shouting George's name, holding a microphone. George didn't stop. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He turned his back sharply, his face set in a grim line of worry, and practically ran to a waiting car. The caption on the video, written in neon bold letters, read, "The king is dead." George Strait ignores fans and disrespects new artists. Too old? Too arrogant? He cancelled. Rude frown over it. Norma felt a tear slide down her cheek. She wiped it away angrily. The world saw a rude old man. The world saw arrogance. Norma saw the truth. She remembered that phone call. She remembered the color draining from George's face when their daughter-in-law called to say that their youngest grandson had collapsed at school with a seizure. She remembered George dropping everything, leaving a meeting with executives mid-sentence, ignoring the flashing cameras, ignoring the world because his blood, his legacy, his little boy was in danger. He had run to that car, not to escape his fans, but to get to the airport to fly home to be a grandfather. But the internet didn't care about grandfathers. It cared about clicks. It cared about drama. And now, the video had 12 million views. The comments were a sewer of insults. "He thinks he's a god," one user wrote. "Time to retire, Grandpa," wrote another. "Never listening to his music again." Norma touched the screen, pausing the video on George's worried face. She knew that look. It wasn't arrogance, it was terror. But no one asked, no one checked. They just judged. The sound of the back door opening made her jump. George walked in, dusting off his jeans. He looked tired. Not the good kind of tired that comes from a day of honest work, but the soul-deep exhaustion of a man who feels the world shifting under his feet in a way he cannot control. He hung his hat on the rack, the same hook he had used for 40 years. He looked at Norma, and he knew. He saw the iPad. He saw her red eyes. He sighed, a sound that rumbled deep in his chest like distant thunder. He walked over to the sink and poured himself a glass of water, his back to her. He drank it in one long gulp, staring out at the yard. He didn't want to talk about it. That was his way. You don't complain about the rain, you just fix the roof. But this wasn't rain. This was acid. Norma walked over to him and placed a hand on his back. The muscles were tense, hard as rock. "They are cancelling the gala, George," she whispered, her voice breaking. George froze. The glass in his hand stopped halfway to the counter. The gala. The charity rodeo he had hosted for 20 years. The event that raised millions for military families and children with severe illnesses. It was the one thing he was most proud of, more than the 60 #1 hits. He turned slowly to face her, his blue eyes losing their sparkle, dimming into a grey sadness. "Who called?" he asked, his voice low and steady, though Norma could hear the crack in the foundation. "The sponsors," she said, looking down. "Big Ford called. Then the beverage company. They said the optics are bad right now. They said the online backlash is too loud. They don't want to be associated with someone who is out of touch and hostile." George let out a short, bitter laugh. It was a dry sound, devoid of humor. "Hostile," he repeated. "I was rushing to see if my grandson was going to live or die, and I'm hostile." He shook his head, walking past her to the table. He looked down at the iPad, at the frozen image of Kyler J's mocking grin. "This boy," George said, pointing a calloused finger at the screen. "He doesn't know a G chord from a fence post. He shoved a camera in my face while I was on the phone with the doctor. I didn't even see him, Norma. I didn't even see him." George pulled a chair out and sat down heavily. He looked smaller suddenly. The legend was shrinking. "Maybe they're right," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "Maybe I am a relic. Maybe the world doesn't need a cowboy who doesn't know how to dance for a telephone screen." Norma felt a surge of fury rising in her chest, hot and fierce. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice rising. "Don't you dare let them win, George. You are George Strait. You are the finest man I have ever known. You have to say something. We have to put out a statement. Tell them about the emergency. Tell them why you ran." George looked up at her, and the sadness in his eyes broke her heart. He shook his head slowly. "No," he said firmly. "I don't trade my family's privacy for public approval, Norma. You know that. I never have. If I tell them about the boy, then the cameras turn on him. Then they are at the hospital. Then they are analyzing his medical records. I will not feed my grandson to the wolves just to save my reputation. If they want to hate me, let them hate me. I can take it, but I won't drag our family into the mud to clean my boots." It was a noble stance. It was the code of the West: protect the family, endure the pain. But the modern world didn't understand the code of the West. The modern world devoured silence and filled it with poison. The phone on the wall rang. It was the landline, a shrill, demanding sound. George didn't move. Norma picked it up. She listened for a moment, her face paling, her lips pressing into a thin, white line. She hung up gently. "Who was it?" George asked, though he seemed to already know. "It was the Children's Hospital in Dallas," Norma said, her voice barely a whisper. "They are postponing the wing dedication, the one named after you. They said they need to wait until the controversy settles." George closed his eyes. That wing was supposed to open next week. He had personally donated $3 million to build it, so parents wouldn't have to sleep in chairs while their babies fought cancer. He had done it anonymously mostly, but the name was going to be a surprise honor. Now they didn't want his name on the wall. The rejection hit him harder than any physical blow. It wasn't about ego. It was about the realization that a lie, traveled halfway around the world while the truth was still putting on its boots, had the power to destroy actual good. He stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I'm going to the barn," he said. It was his escape, his fortress. "Don't wait up." "Don't." Norma watched him go. She watched the man she had loved since high school, the man who had held her hand through the death of a child, through the dizzying heights of fame, through every storm life had thrown at them, walk out the door with his shoulders slumped. He looked defeated. He looked like he was ready to hang up the hat forever. The screen of the iPad went dark, reflecting her own face. She looked at herself. She wasn't a star. She wasn't an influencer. She was a mother, a grandmother, a wife, and she was angry. The house fell silent, but the silence was screaming. Norma paced the kitchen. She looked at the photos on the fridge. George teaching the grandkids to fish. George visiting a veteran with no legs, holding his hand for hours with no cameras around. George writing a check for a waitress who couldn't afford her car repair simply because he overheard her crying. The world didn't know this man. The world knew the album covers. The world knew the spotlight, but they didn't know the heart. And because they didn't know, they were destroying him. She looked at the iPad again. She knew George's rule. Privacy above all. Never complain, never explain. But rules were for normal times. This was war. And in war you protect the ones you love by any means necessary. She walked over to the table and picked up the device. Her hands were shaking so hard she almost dropped it. She had seen the grandkids do this. They called it going live. She fumbled with the passcode. It was their anniversary date. She opened the social media app that the publicist had installed years ago and that George never touched. She saw the icon, a little camera with the word live. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. If she did this, George might be furious. He might feel betrayed. He hated the spotlight shining on his private life. But if she didn't do this, the lie would become the history. The lie would win. And she couldn't live in a world where Kyler J's lie was louder than George Strait's truth. Outside, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep indigos and violets. The shadows stretched long across the ranch. George was in the tack room, surrounded by the smell of leather and saddle soap. He was cleaning a bridle, the repetitive motions soothing his mind. He was trying to accept it, trying to accept that perhaps his time had passed. Maybe he should just sell the guitars. Maybe the world had become too cruel for a simple cowboy. He didn't hear the owl hooting in the distance. He was lost in a dark reverie, feeling the weight of a lifetime of integrity crumbling under the weight of 15 seconds of video. Back in the kitchen, Norma propped the iPad up against a vase of freshly cut sunflowers. The lighting was dim, just the warm glow of the under-cabinet lights. She didn't check her hair. She didn't put on lipstick. She wore a simple cotton blouse, and her reading glasses were perched on her head. She took a deep breath, a breath that drew in all the years of love and sacrifice, and she pressed the button. The screen swirled for a second, connecting to the ether, connecting to the millions of invisible eyes. "You are now live," the screen said. At first, the number in the corner was 0, then 50, then 500. The algorithm, sensing the account of the king was active, sent out the beacon. 5,000, 20,000. The numbers spun like a slot machine. Comments began to fly up the screen, too fast to read. "Is this real? Is that Norma? Where is George? Apologize. We love you, George." It was a chaotic stream of noise. Norma stared into the little black dot of the camera. She felt terrified. She felt exposed. But then she thought of George's slumped shoulders. She thought of the hospital wing. She thought of the truth. "Hello," she said. Her voice was shaky, cracking slightly. She cleared her throat. "I don't know if I'm doing this right. I'm Norma, George's wife." The viewer count hit 50,000. I know there is a lot of noise right now," she continued, her hands clasping together on the table, visible in the frame. "I know you've seen a video. I know you think you saw a man who is arrogant, a man who turned his back on a fan." She paused, looking down at her hands, then looked straight back into the lens with a piercing intensity. "But you didn't see what I saw. You didn't hear the phone ring 3 minutes before that video was taken. You didn't hear a mother screaming that her son wasn't breathing right." The comments slowed down. The hateful emojis paused. The raw emotion in her voice was cutting through the digital static. "My husband," she said, tears welling up but not falling. "George, he isn't here right now. He's in the barn. He's in the barn because he thinks you all hate him. He thinks he failed you. He's cleaning saddles because the charity he has supported for 20 years just told him he isn't good enough anymore." Her voice hardened. "And he won't defend himself. He won't tell you the truth because he is trying to protect our grandson's privacy. He is taking the bullets to save a little boy from the cameras." The number hit 100,000. The internet was stopping. The scroll was pausing. "But I am not George," Norma said, leaning closer to the camera. "I don't have his patience, and I don't have his silence. I have been watching this man for 50 years. I have watched him stop his tour bus on the side of a highway to help change a tire for a stranger in the rain. I have watched him sit by the bedside of dying children, singing Amarillo by morning softly until they fell asleep, and then going to the bathroom to weep so their parents wouldn't see him break. She reached out and picked up a framed photo from the counter behind her. It was an old faded picture of George, young and unlined, holding their daughter Jennifer, who had passed away years ago. "He knows grief," Norma whispered, holding the photo to the camera. "He knows pain and he knows love. That boy in the video, that influencer, he wanted a soundbite. He wanted content. George wanted to get home to his family. If that makes him a villain in your eyes, then the world has lost its way." In the barn, the silence was broken. George's old flip phone, which he had left on a hay bale, began to buzz. Then it buzzed again, and again. It was vibrating against the wood so hard it sounded like an angry hornet. George frowned. He put down the bridle and walked over to it. He flipped it open. A text from his manager. "George, look at the internet, now." Another text from his son. "Dad, Mom is live. You need to see this." George felt a cold spike of adrenaline. Mom is live? What did that mean? He didn't have a smartphone on him. He grabbed his hat and strode out of the barn, his boots crunching heavily on the gravel. He walked faster, his heart pounding. Had something happened? Was she hurt? He saw the light on in the kitchen window. He saw Norma sitting at the table, talking to the air, talking to the flower vase. He opened the back door quietly. The air inside was charged electric. He heard her voice before he saw her face. "He thinks he's just a cowboy," Norma was saying, wiping her eyes. "He thinks his music is all he has to give. But his heart is the biggest thing about him, and I won't let you break it. I won't let a 15-second lie erase 50 years of honor." George froze in the doorway. He stood in the shadows of the mudroom listening. He watched his wife, the woman who had been his rock, stripping her soul bare for the world to see. He saw the iPad propped up. He realized what was happening. She was fighting for him. She was doing the one thing he refused to do. She was breaking the code to save the cowboy. He stepped into the light. The floorboards creaked. Norma gasped and looked up. Her eyes were wide, fearful. She thought he would be angry. She moved to cover the camera to hide the deed. "George, she stammered. But the camera saw him. 300,000 people saw him. They saw George straight, not in a starch-pressed shirt and a cowboy hat, but in a dusty work shirt, his hair messy, his face etched with a vulnerability that no music video had ever captured. He didn't look like a star. He looked like a husband. George didn't look at the iPad. He didn't care about the 300,000 people. He only cared about the one person in the room. He reached out and took Norma's hand, the one that was hovering over the screen. His hand engulfed hers, rough skin against soft. He looked at her with an expression that was a mixture of awe and reprimand and overwhelming love. "Norma," he said, his voice raspy, picked up clearly by the microphone, "you know I don't like this." "I know," she whispered, tears spilling over now. "But they needed to know, George. They needed to know why you ran." George looked at the iPad then. He leaned down, his face filling the frame. For a second, the entire country held its breath. The king was about to speak. Was he going to rage? Was he going to leave? He looked into the lens, his blue eyes piercing through the digital noise, straight into the souls of the people watching on their couches, in their cars, in their beds. He didn't smile. He just nodded, a slow, solemn nod of acknowledgement. "My grandson is fine," George said simply, the truth unadorned. "He's home, he's safe, that's all that matters to me, but—" He paused, looking down at Norma, squeezing her hand. "It seems I have a wife who loves me more than I deserve. And if she says I'm a good man, well, I spend every day trying to be the man she thinks I am." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't attack the influencer. He just affirmed his love. He reached out with his free hand towards the screen. "Say good night, Norma," he said softly. "Good night," Norma whispered. George's thumb covered the lens, and the screen went black. The live stream ended. But the energy it released was just beginning to ripple outward. In the silence of the kitchen, George and Norma stood looking at each other. The device sat dark on the table between them. "You're dangerous with that thing," George said, the ghost of a smile finally touching his lips. "Someone had to be," Norma replied, standing up and wrapping her arms around his waist, burying her face in his chest. "Someone had to shoot back." George held her, listening to the wind outside. The storm he had felt coming had arrived, but it wasn't a storm of destruction. It was a rain that washes away the dust. But the night wasn't over. The world had seen the truth, but the consequences of the lie were still in motion. The charity was still cancelled. The reputation was still bruised. And somewhere in Nashville, Kyler J. was watching his phone, realizing that he had just awakened a sleeping giant, and the backlash was about to change direction like a hurricane hitting the coast. George looked out the window into the darkness. "Make some coffee, Norma," he said quietly. "It's going to be a long night." The silence that followed the end of the broadcast was heavier than the humid Texas air outside, but it was a different kind of weight. Before, the house had been filled with the suffocating pressure of a lie. Now, it was filled with the vibrating resonance of the truth. The iPad sat on the kitchen table like a cooling weapon, its screen black, but the invisible waves it had sent out were crashing against shorelines all over the world. George didn't move for a long time. He stood with his hand resting on Norma's shoulder, his breathing slow and deep, the way a man breathes after he has just wrestled a steer to the ground and is waiting for the adrenaline to drain from his veins. He looked at the coffee maker as it hissed and sputtered, the smell of dark roast filling the room, grounding him. It was a smell he knew. It was real. Unlike the internet. "So you realized what you just did?" George asked, his voice low, a rumble that vibrated through Norma's chair. He wasn't angry, but he was stunned. He was a man who planned his set lists 6 months in advance, who checked the weather reports 3 times before moving cattle. He was not a man of impulse, and his wife had just pulled the trigger on the biggest impulse of their lives. Norma turned in her chair, reaching up to cover his hand with hers. Her eyes were red, but they were dry now. The fear was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective defiance. "I told them who you are, George, because you wouldn't, and I would do it again. I would do it 1,000 times." George looked down at her, and the corners of his eyes crinkled. It was the look that had made millions of women swoon in the 80s, but it was reserved only for her. "I reckon you would," he murmured. He pulled a chair out and sat next to her, his knees cracking slightly. A reminder of the years, of the miles. "But now the genie is out of the bottle, Norma, and we can't put the cork back in." As if on cue, the phone on the wall began to ring again. Then George's flip phone on the table buzzed. Then the iPad, which they thought was asleep, lit up with a notification banner that cascaded down the screen like a waterfall. New York Times, Rolling Stone, CNN, Fox News. Everyone wanted a statement. Everyone wanted to know about the grandson. George stared at the devices with a look of profound exhaustion. "Turn them off," he said. "All of them." "George, we can't just—" "Turn them off, Norma," he repeated, his voice gentle but absolute. "Tonight is for us. Tonight is for the family. The world can wait until the sun comes up. If they want to talk, they can talk to the fence posts." Norma hesitated, then nodded. She powered down the iPad. She took the receiver off the hook of the landline. George flipped his phone shut and tossed it onto the counter. The silence returned, blessed and holy. George stood up and poured 2 mugs of coffee, black, no sugar. He handed one to Norma and motioned toward the back porch. "Come on, the stars are out." Meanwhile, 1,000 miles away in a penthouse apartment in Nashville, the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. Kyler J., the architect of George's misery, was pacing across a white shag rug, his designer boots sinking into the expensive fabric. The room was lit by neon signs and the glow of 3 large monitors. "What do you mean the sentiment has flipped?" Kyler shouted, running a hand through his bleached hair. "I had the momentum. He was the villain. He was the grumpy old man." His manager, a frantic man named Sid, who was sweating through his t-shirt, was scrolling furiously on a laptop. "It's gone, Kyler. It's totally gone. Look at the ratio. You have 200,000 dislikes on your last post in 20 minutes. People are unsubscribing by the second. They're calling you a vulture. They're calling you a liar. Kyler stopped pacing. He looked at the screen. The comments were scrolling so fast they were a blur, but he caught the keywords. Respect. Legend. Family. You suck. Who are you? She cried, Sid said, shaking his head in disbelief. His wife went live and she cried, Kyler, and then he walked in. It was authentic. You can't fight authentic with a filter. You just can't. Kyler felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He wasn't a musician, not really. He was a brand. He sold an image of new country, of parties and trucks he didn't know how to fix. He had attacked George Strait because he thought George was an easy target, a silent relic who wouldn't fight back. He hadn't counted on the wife. He hadn't counted on the fact that George Strait didn't need to fight back because an army of millions would rise up to do it for him. "We need to spin this," Kyler said, his voice rising in panic. "Draft an apology. Say I didn't know. Say I was concerned for his health. Say I was trying to get his attention to ask for advice." Sid looked at him with disgust. "You think they're going to buy that? You posted a video with a clown emoji over his face, Kyler." "Just fix it," Kyler screamed, throwing a throw pillow at the wall. "I have a sponsorship with that energy drink company pending. If I lose that, I can't pay the lease on this place." The irony was thick enough to choke on. The man who had tried to destroy a legend for clicks was now watching his own digital empire crumble because he had underestimated the power of the truth. Back at the ranch, the night air was cooling. George and Norma sat in the rocking chairs on the porch, the rhythmic creak-creak the only sound competing with the crickets. George was looking out toward the east pasture, where the silhouette of the old oak tree stood against the starlight. "How is Colt?" George asked after a long silence. "He's stable," Norma said softly. "Janet texted me before I turned the phone off. The doctors say it was a reaction to the new medication. They have him monitored. He's sleeping." George nodded, closing his eyes. He let out a breath he felt he had been holding for 3 days. "I was so scared, Norma," he whispered. The vulnerability in his voice was startling. "When I got that call in Nashville, I didn't see the cameras. I didn't see the people. All I saw was Colt's face. I saw him fishing with me last summer. I saw him laughing. The thought of losing him." His voice trailed off, swallowed by the night. "I know." Norma reached over and squeezed his arm. "That's what makes you a good man, George. You put the important things first, always." "But it cost us," George said, opening his eyes and looking at her. "The gala, the hospital wing. My name is mud to those corporate people, Norma. Even with your video, damage is done. They showed their true colors. They were ready to drop me the second the wind changed." "Then let them go," Norma said fiercely. "We don't need them. We can do the gala ourselves. We can fund the wing ourselves if we have to." "It's not about the money," George said, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "It's about the honor. A handshake used to mean something in this town. A man's reputation was built on 40 years of actions, not 40 seconds of video. I feel like a stranger in my own industry, Norma. Maybe it really is time to hang it up. Just stay here. Watch the cows. Let the world have their Kyler Jays." It was the deepest wound, the betrayal. George Strait had carried the banner of traditional country music for decades. He had kept it pure, and the industry he had saved had turned on him instantly to appease a mob of teenagers with smartphones. Just then, headlights swept across the long driveway. A car was approaching the gate, then another, then a third. George stiffened. "Reporters," he growled. "I told them to stay away." He stood up, his posture changing instantly from weary grandfather to protective patriarch. "Stay here," he told Norma. "George, don't—" "I'm just going to the gate," he said. He walked down the steps, his boots thudding on the dirt. He climbed into his truck and started the engine. He drove down the long, winding gravel path toward the main gate, the headlights cutting through the darkness. When he reached the gate, he expected to see news vans. He expected microphones and bright lights. But as he slowed the truck, he saw something else. It was a pickup truck, an old Ford, rusted around the wheel wells, and behind it, a sedan, and behind that, a minivan. People were standing outside the gate, not reporters, just people, families, men in ball caps, women in denim jackets. George rolled down his window but didn't unlock the gate. He kept the engine running. "This is private property," he called out, his voice stern. A man stepped forward from the rusted Ford. He looked to be in his 50s, wearing a mechanic's shirt with the name Earl stitched on the pocket. He took off his hat and held it against his chest. "We know, Mr. Straight," Earl said, his voice respectful, trembling slightly. "We ain't here to bother you. We saw the video, your wife's video." George watched him, wary. And we wanted you to know," Earl continued, gesturing to the small group behind him, maybe 15 people in total, standing in the dust. "We drove up from Poteet. These folks are from Careville. We just wanted you to know that we didn't believe the lie, not for a second." A woman stepped forward, holding a small candle. "My daddy died of cancer last year," she said, her voice breaking. "His last request was to listen to Troubadour. You got us through the hardest night of our lives, George. We aren't going to let some internet boy tear you down." "We brought some flowers," another man said, pointing to a pile of bouquets and handwritten cards stacked neatly against the stone pillar of the gate. "For your grandson. We hope he's okay." George sat in his truck, the engine idling. The toughness, the stoicism, the wall he had built around his heart to survive the last 3 days, it all began to crack. These weren't sponsors. These weren't executives. These were the people, his people, the ones who saved their money to buy a ticket, the ones who played his songs at weddings and funerals. He turned off the truck. He opened the door and stepped out. He walked up to the gate. The group fell silent, awestruck. George reached through the bars and extended his hand. "What's your name?" he asked Earl. "Earl, sir, Earl Davis." George shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Earl. Thank you for coming." He looked at the woman with the candle. "Thank you, ma'am." "We're praying for Colt," she whispered. George swallowed the lump in his throat. "He's doing better. Thank you." He stayed there for 10 minutes, shaking hands through the bars, listening to their stories. No selfies were taken. No one asked for an autograph. They just wanted to offer respect. When George finally drove back to the house, the bitterness that had been poisoning his spirit was gone, replaced by a profound, aching gratitude. The industry might have turned, but the people hadn't. The next morning, the sun rose with a brilliance that seemed to mock the darkness of the previous days. The ranch was bathed in gold. George was in the kitchen frying bacon when the landline rang. He had plugged it back in. He picked it up. "Hello? George? It's Bill. From the beverage company." The voice on the other end was fast, nervous, dripping with false camaraderie. George didn't say anything. He just flipped the bacon. "Listen, George," Bill continued, filling the silence. "We saw the update from Norma. Very moving, very powerful. We feel terrible about the misunderstanding. We want to reinstate the sponsorship for the gala. In fact, we want to double it. We want to issue a press release today saying we stand with the king. How does that sound?" George placed the fork down. He looked out the window at the empty corral. He thought about Earl and the rusted Ford. He thought about the woman with the candle. Then he thought about Bill, who had cancelled a 20-year partnership via voicemail because of a TikTok video. "Bill," George said, his voice calm and level. "Yes, George?" "No." There was a stunned silence on the other end. I don't understand. We're doubling the money." "It's not about the money, Bill," George said. "You panicked. You didn't call me to ask for the truth. You assumed the worst. You let a stranger define my character. But George, it's business. We have shareholders." "And I have a family," George said. "And I have a code. You broke it. I don't do business with people who don't have enough sand in their craw to stand by a friend when it rains. Keep your money." "George, wait, this is a mistake. You can't fund the gala alone." "Watch me," George said, and he hung up the phone. He felt lighter. He felt 10 years younger. He turned to see Norma standing in the doorway, a proud smile on her face. She had heard everything. "That was expensive," she noted, walking over to steal a piece of bacon. "We'll manage," George said. "I'll sell the boat if I have to, or I'll do a residency, but I'm not taking their money. We're going to do this rodeo our way, for the people who actually care." But the challenges were far from over, As the day wore on, the reality of the situation set in. The viral moment was powerful, but institutions are slow to turn. The Children's Hospital Board was still silent. The permit for the rodeo grounds was still on hold because the City Council was reviewing safety concerns. And then Kyler J made his move. Around noon, a notification popped up. Kyler had posted a new video. George and Norma watched it together. Kyler was sitting on a couch looking somber. He was wearing a plain t-shirt, no jewelry. He looked like a kicked puppy. "Hey guys," he said, his voice soft. "I just wanted to address the George Strait situation. I had no idea about his grandson. I feel terrible. I'm donating $10,000 to charity in his name. I just want to say I respect George. He's a legend. Let's spread love, not hate." It was slick. It was calculated. It was designed to stop the bleeding of his own follower count. "He's lying," Norma said instantly. "Look at his eyes. He's reading a teleprompter." "It doesn't matter," George said, turning away. "It's noise." But it did matter, because the media outlets picked it up. Influencer apologizes, donates to charity. Feud over. The narrative was shifting again, trying to wrap everything up in a neat little bow. Everyone is friends now. It minimized the damage Kyler had caused. It trivialized the pain. George felt a fresh wave of frustration. He didn't want a fake apology. He wanted accountability. He wanted the world to understand that actions have consequences that can't be fixed with a bank transfer. "He's coming to the gala," Norma said, reading the comments on Kyler's video. "His fans are telling him to go to the gala to apologize in person, to make peace." George's eyes narrowed. "He wouldn't dare." "He might," Norma said, "if he thinks it will get him content. If he thinks he can get a picture with you and look like the bigger man who bridged the generational gap." George slammed his hand on the table. "I will not have that circus at my event. That event is for the veterans, it's for the kids. It is not a backdrop for his redemption arc." The phone rang again. It was the director of the foundation. "George," she said, sounding stressed, "we have a problem. Since the sponsors pulled out, the venue is threatening to cancel the booking. They need the deposit by tomorrow morning, full amount, or we lose the arena." "How much?" George asked. 200,000. And with the other sponsors gone, yeah, we don't have it." George looked at Norma. 200,000 was a lot of liquid cash, even for him on such short notice. His assets were tied up in land and investments. "I'll get it," George said. "Tell them the check will be there at 8 a.m. He hung up. He looked at Norma. "I need to go to the bank, and then I need to go to the hospital to see Colt, and then I have to figure out how to stop a social media hurricane from crashing my rodeo." He grabbed his hat. He paused at the door. "Norma, yesterday you saved my reputation. Tomorrow I have to save the mission. I don't know if I can fight this new world, but I'm going to go down swinging." He walked out into the heat. The dusty road awaited him. But this time he wasn't driving aimlessly. He was driving with a purpose. The king was back in the saddle, and he had a rodeo to save. As he drove toward town, he passed a billboard. It was an advertisement for Kyler J's new album. The face smiled down at him, smooth and airbrushed. George gripped the steering wheel. The battle wasn't over. The truth had been spoken, but the war for integrity was just beginning. The gala was in 3 days, and George had a feeling that Kyler J wasn't going to stay in Nashville. The confrontation was inevitable. Old school versus new school. Authenticity versus algorithm. And it would all happen on the dirt floor of a rodeo arena. The morning of the gala broke with a sky the color of bruised steel. A storm was brewing in the Gulf, pushing heavy, humid air up into San Antonio, making the flags at the AT&T Center snap and whip violently against their poles. It was fitting weather. The atmosphere inside the arena was just as turbulent. George stood in the center of the dirt floor, the arena empty save for the volunteers who were scrambling to set up chairs and hang banners. There were no corporate logos this year, no Ford Tough signs, no massive beer inflatables. Instead, there were hand-painted signs made by local elementary schools. "We love George, Texas strong for the kids." It looked less like a televised spectacular and more like a church potluck held in a coliseum. "We're short on security," his production manager, a grizzly old roadie named Huck, said, walking up with a clipboard. Since the agency pulled out, we don't have enough guys to man the VIP entrance. George adjusted his hat, looking at the empty seats that would soon be filled with 15,000 people. We don't need a VIP entrance, Huck. There are no VIPs tonight. Everyone comes in the front door. Everyone sits where they find a spot. Even the mayor. Especially the mayor, George said. And if anyone causes trouble, well, we've got about 300 cowboys from the rodeo circuit backstage. I reckon they can handle a heckler or two. The decision to self-fund had drained George's liquid reserves. He had walked into the bank the day before and emptied his personal savings, money meant for the ranch's expansion, to pay the venue deposit. Norma had sold her vintage jewelry collection to pay for the catering. They were all in. If this failed, if the seats remained empty, it wouldn't just be a PR disaster, it would be a financial crater. But as the doors opened at 6 p.m., George's fears evaporated. They didn't just come, they poured in. It was a sea of Stetsons and Wranglers, a tide of humanity that flowed into the arena. They weren't the corporate crowd in rented tuxedos. They were the people from the grocery store, the mechanics, the teachers, the soldiers from the nearby base. They filled the seats to the rafters. The noise was deafening, not the polite applause of a gala, but the raucous, joyful roar of a family reunion. Backstage in the dressing room, George was tuning his guitar. His hands were steady, but his heart was hammering. He looked at himself in the mirror. The lines on his face were deeper than they used to be. The eyes were tired, but the jaw was set. Norma walked in looking radiant in a simple blue dress, wearing a necklace made of turquoise instead of the diamonds she had sold. She kissed his cheek. "Colt just texted," she said, smiling. "He's watching the live stream from his hospital bed. He says, 'Give 'em hell, Papa.'" George smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "Language," he chided gently, but his eyes were wet. "Is everything ready?" "Yes," Norma said. Then her face darkened slightly. "But he is here." George didn't have to ask who. "Kyler. He just pulled up to the loading dock," Norma said, her voice tight with distaste. "Black SUV, 2 cameramen. He's streaming his arrival. He's treating it like a red carpet event, George. He wants to come backstage." George set the guitar down in its stand. He stood up, smoothing his shirt. "Let him in." Norma blinked. "What?" "I said let him in," George said, his voice calm, dangerous. "If he wants a show, let's give him a front row seat. Bring him to the shoot. I'll meet him there before I go on." The loading dock was chaotic. Horses were being unloaded, bulls were snorting in their pens, and the smell of manure and hay was thick in the air. Into this gritty reality stepped Kyler J. He looked like a peacock in a poultry farm. He was wearing a sequined jacket that cost more than most of the trucks in the parking lot, and his white sneakers were already stained with dust. He was holding his phone up, talking rapidly to his followers. "We are here, guys, backstage at the King's Rodeo. We're going to squash the beef. We're going to show some love." He turned a corner and nearly ran into a wall, but it wasn't a wall. It was George Strait. George was leaning against a wooden post, arms crossed. He wasn't surrounded by security. He was alone. He looked at Kyler with a gaze that was heavy and impenetrable. Kyler froze. He lowered the phone slightly but didn't stop recording. "George, Mr. Strait." Kyler put on his best media smile, stepping forward with an outstretched hand. "So good to see you, man. I just wanted to come by and pay my respects. Show the world that there's no hard feelings, right?" George didn't take the hand. He looked at the phone, then at the cameramen behind Kyler. "Put the cameras down, son." "Oh, we're just documenting the—" "I said put them down," George said. He didn't shout, he didn't have to. The tone was the same one he used to calm a spooked stallion. It was absolute. The cameramen looked at Kyler. Kyler hesitated, his smile faltering. He nodded nervously. The cameras were lowered. Kyler slipped his phone into his pocket. "Look, George," Kyler started, his voice dropping the influencer cadence and becoming whiny. "I know things got out of hand, but it was great publicity for both of us, right? I mean, look at the engagement numbers. I brought you a check. $10,000 for the charity. I was hoping we could do a photo op on stage, you know, passing the torch." George looked at the boy. He saw the hollowness. He saw a generation that measured worth in views, not values. He felt a pang of pity. "You think this is about engagement?" George asked softly. He pushed off the post and took a step closer. Kyla shrank back. You think because you have 1 million people watching you eat your breakfast, you understand what it means to hold a microphone? I'm just trying to help, Kyla stammered. Then help, George said. He pointed to a group of men in wheelchairs sitting near the arena entrance. They were veterans. Some were missing legs. Some were burned. That's Sergeant Miller. He lost his sight in Afghanistan. He loves country music because it's the only thing that quiets the ringing in his ears. Go sit with him. What? You want to be here, George continued. You want to be part of this. Then go sit with Sergeant Miller. Don't take a picture. Don't post about it. Just sit there, hold his hand and listen to his story. Do that for an hour. Then, and only then, you can come talk to me about passing a torch. Kyla looked at the veterans. They looked rough. They weren't glamorous. There was no ring light over there. I have a schedule, George. I have to be at the after party in Austin by 11. George nodded slowly. I reckoned you did. He turned his back on Kyla. Get him out of here, Huck, George said over his shoulder. He's blocking the walkway. Kyla stood there, stunned. He had expected a fight. He had expected a hug. He hadn't expected to be dismissed like a nuisance. He pulled out his phone to start a rant, to tell his followers how rude George was. But then he looked around. He saw the cowboys glaring at him. He saw the realness of the place, and for the first time in his life, he felt shame. He turned around and walked back to his SUV, his sequined jacket shimmering pathetically under the fluorescent lights. He didn't post anything that night. George walked up the ramp to the stage. The lights went down. The crowd roared. It was a sound that shook the dust from the rafters. A single spotlight hit center stage. George stepped into the light. He was wearing his signature starch-pressed Wrangler shirt and his resistal hat. He picked up his guitar. He didn't say a word. He just struck the opening G chord of Amarillo by Morning. The crowd sang every word. They sang so loud that George stopped playing for a moment, just listening to them. It was a choir of 15,000 souls. It was a vindication. Halfway through the set, George stopped. The arena went silent. He walked to the microphone. I want to thank you all for coming, he said, his voice echoing. I know there's been a lot of noise lately, a lot of talk. He paused. He looked up at the private box where Norma was watching. They say you can't teach an old dog new tricks, George said, smiling. And maybe they're right. I don't know how to tweet. I don't know how to go viral. But I know how to love my family. And I know how to stand by my friends. The crowd erupted. Hats were thrown in the air. This night isn't about me, George continued, his voice thick with emotion. It's about the folks who can't speak for themselves. The sponsors left us, folks. They took their money and ran. Boos rained down from the stands. But George raised a hand. My wife, Norma, she told me something. She said we don't need them. She said we have you. He gestured to the screen behind him. A live counter appeared. We are raising money tonight for the Children's Hospital, for the wing where my grandson Colt was treated this week. A hush fell over the crowd at the mention of the boy. He's okay, George reassured them. He's watching right now. Hey, Colt. George waved at the camera. But there are kids in that hallway who aren't okay, and they need us. So I'm asking you, if you have $1, if you have 5, help us finish what the suits wouldn't. The counter on the screen started to move. It was linked to a text-to-donate number. It jumped from $10,000 to $50,000 in seconds, then $100,000. People were pulling out their phones. The analog crowd was using the digital tool for good. By the end of the night, when George played the final note of The Cowboy Rides Away, the counter stood at 2.4 million. They hadn't just matched the corporate sponsorship, they had tripled it. George stood center stage, tears streaming openly down his face. He took off his hat and held it over his heart. He bowed to the people, not as a king, but as a servant. 3 days later, the chaos had subsided. The trucks were gone. The stage was disassembled. The ranch was quiet again. George sat on the tailgate of his truck, parked on a high ridge overlooking his property. The sun was setting, painting the Texas sky in the same brilliant oranges and purples that had started this journey. Next to him sat Colt. The boy looked pale, a little thinner, but he was upright, holding a fishing pole. You get a bite yet, Papa? Colt asked. Not yet, son, George said, adjusting the boy's hat. Fishing ain't about catching. It's about waiting. Like you waited for the bad man to go away, Colt asked innocently. George chuckled. Something like that. Norma walked up the path, carrying a basket of sandwiches. She looked tired but happy. The gala had been a massive success. The hospital wing was fully funded and would open next month, named the Colt Straight Wing at the donor's insistence. The media narrative had flipped completely. Kyler J. had issued a real apology, deleted his social media for a month, and was reportedly volunteering at a soup kitchen, a PR move perhaps, but a start. Norma sat next to George on the tailgate. You know, she said, handing him a sandwich, I got an email from the record label today. Oh yeah? George took a bite. They want to drop me? No, Norma smiled. They want to know when you're releasing a new album. They say your streaming numbers are up 500% with the Gen Z demographic. Apparently, integrity is trending. George laughed, a deep belly laugh that startled a jackrabbit nearby. Well, I'll be damned. He looked at Norma, he looked at Colt, he looked at the land he loved. The world had tried to break him. It had tried to turn his silence into a weapon against him. But the world had forgotten that roots run deeper than wires. A lie can travel around the world in a second, but the truth, like a good country song, lasts forever. I don't think I need to make a new album, George said, reeling in his line. I think I just want to sit here. For how long? Norma asked, leaning her head on his shoulder. George looked at the horizon, where the first star of the evening was just beginning to twinkle. Until the fish bite, Norma, he said softly. Until the fish bite. The wind blew gently through the mesquite trees, carrying the sound of a distant train. The king of country was home. His crown was a sweat-stained hat, his throne was a Chevy tailgate, and his kingdom was safe. And for George Strait, that was more than enough. The screen fades to black, leaving only the sound of the acoustic guitar strumming a final perfect G chord.